For years, the memory of Cannae haunted Rome like a curse. The Republic had faced disasters before, but nothing compared to the horror Hannibal brought to Italian soil. 70,000 Romans lay dead in a single day. Entire families had lost their sons. Every Roman general feared his name. Hannibal Barca, the man who had humiliated the greatest power on earth, still roamed freely in Italy, undefeated. Yet time was changing. The once unstoppable Carthaginian army was growing tired. After years of war, supplies were thin, allies were gone, and soldiers longed to return home. Hannibal remained a master of strategy, but even the greatest generals cannot fight forever on empty ground. Rome, on the other hand, refused to die. After Cannae, the Republic rebuilt itself not through victory, but through endurance. It raised new armies, trained new leaders, and learned from every mistake. The Romans had discovered something Hannibal could not destroy: their will. From that slow recovery rose a new name, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was young when Cannae happened, barely old enough to fight, but he had seen the destruction with his own eyes. His father and uncle had been killed in Spain fighting Carthaginian forces. For Scipio, the war was not politics. It was personal. He swore to end it no matter how long it took. Unlike other Roman commanders, Scipio understood Hannibal's mind. He admired his enemy's brilliance but also studied his weaknesses. Where most generals copied old Roman methods, Scipio innovated. He trained his soldiers to move faster, strike smarter, and adapt on the battlefield. He learned the art of speed, deception, and psychological warfare, the same weapons Hannibal had used to destroy Rome. As Scipio rose through the ranks, he faced doubt from older senators who saw him as reckless. But every victory silenced his critics. In Spain, he captured New Carthage, a stronghold that had supplied Hannibal's armies for years. He treated prisoners with respect, won over local tribes, and began to show the difference between Roman brutality and Roman leadership. By 208 BC, the tide of the war was turning. Hannibal was still in Italy, undefeated but trapped, unable to strike at Rome itself. His army, once the terror of the Republic, was isolated. Scipio had learned how to counter him, not by chasing him, but by cutting off everything that fed his strength. Rome had finally found its answer to Hannibal. Not another general of tradition, but a new kind of commander, young, ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless when needed. Scipio knew that to defeat Carthage, he had to do what no Roman had dared before: carry the war to Africa itself. But before he could bring the fight to Carthage's gates, he had to prove one thing: that Rome's spirit was no longer broken. The ghost of Cannae still hung over the Republic. To destroy it, Scipio would have to rebuild Rome's soul. Rome after Cannae was a wounded giant. Its legions were gone, its pride shattered, and its allies questioned whether the Republic could survive. The fields outside the city were lined with silent families waiting for soldiers who would never return. Mothers, sons, and wives had no graves to visit. Their dead lay somewhere far away on a blood-soaked plain in southern Italy. But Rome was different from every other nation. It did not know how to surrender. Even after its worst defeat, the Senate voted to raise new armies. Boys not yet of age were conscripted, and old veterans returned to service. Wealthy citizens donated gold to rebuild legions. The Republic's message to the world was clear: Rome does not die. Out of this determination rose a new generation of leaders, men who had grown up under the shadow of Hannibal and learned from his victories. Among them stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had already begun reshaping the war. After the death of his father and uncle in Spain, Scipio was given command of a Roman army there, a shocking decision since he was barely 24 years old. Many in the Senate considered it madness. But Rome had few choices left. and Scipio had the confidence of a man born to lead. Spain was crucial. It was the beating heart of Carthage's empire, full of silver mines, troops, and resources that supplied Hannibal's campaign in Italy. To defeat Hannibal, Scipio had to choke the source. When he arrived, he found not soldiers, but survivors, demoralized, disorganized, and terrified of the Carthaginian generals who had ruled Spain for years. Instead of punishing them, Scipio inspired them. He spoke to the men like a brother, not a politician. He promised them victory not through revenge, but through discipline and faith in themselves. His first major strike came against New Carthage, a coastal city considered impossible to take. Scipio studied the tide charts and realized something brilliant. At low tide, one side of the city's wall became vulnerable. While the enemy was focused on defending the front, Scipio launched a surprise assault through the shallows. His soldiers climbed the walls, opened the gates, and captured the city in a single day. It was more than a victory, it was a message. Rome was learning to think like Hannibal. Scipio then began winning hearts instead of just battles. He freed captured locals, treated prisoners with respect, and even returned a captured woman unharmed to her fiancé, gaining the loyalty of entire tribes. He understood that true conquest was not only military, it was psychological. Where Hannibal inspired fear, Scipio inspired belief. Over the next few years, Scipio defeated one Carthaginian army after another in Spain. He adapted constantly, using terrain, speed, and deception the same way Hannibal had used them against Rome. By the time he finally drove the Carthaginians out of Spain, he had transformed himself from an ambitious young officer into one of the greatest commanders Rome had ever produced. But his eyes were now on something far greater. Spain was only the beginning. If Rome truly wanted to end this war, it couldn't just defend Italy. It had to strike Carthage itself. The Senate hesitated. Many still remembered Cannae and feared another catastrophe. But Scipio was relentless. He argued that Hannibal's strength was fading, and that the only way to end his shadow over Italy was to bring the war to his doorstep. By 204 BC, the Senate gave in. Rome would invade Africa. Scipio would lead them. The boy who had survived Rome's darkest day was about to challenge the man who caused it. The decision to invade Africa shocked the ancient world. For nearly 2 decades, Rome had fought on its own soil, defending itself against Hannibal's relentless campaign. Now, for the first time, it would carry the war to Carthage's doorstep. The Senate's approval of Scipio's plan was not a sign of confidence. It was a gamble born of desperation. But Scipio believed this was the only path to victory. He knew that defeating Hannibal in Italy was impossible. The Carthaginian general had spent years mastering the terrain, forming alliances, and reading Rome's every move. If Rome wanted to break free from this endless defense, it had to strike at the source. It had to make Hannibal come home. When Scipio sailed for Africa in 204 BC, he brought with him not just legions but a vision of total victory. His men adored him. They had seen him fight in Spain, where he turned defeat into dominance. He treated them not as pawns, but as brothers in arms. Discipline under him was strict, but morale was high. They believed they were following the man destined to erase Hannibal's shadow forever. The African coast was unlike anything the Romans had faced before. Hot, dry, and full of danger. Carthage, though weakened, was still rich and powerful, supported by its North African allies, especially the Numidians. Their cavalry was unmatched, swift and deadly. Scipio knew he would have to win them over or destroy them. At first, Carthage underestimated him. They sent small armies to push him back toward the sea, but Scipio's tactics were precise. He trained his soldiers to adapt quickly, striking at weak points and vanishing before counterattacks could form. When the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Gisco tried to trap him, Scipio countered with speed and deception, destroying his camps and breaking his formations before the battle even began. Then came the crucial move: Scipio's alliance with Massinissa, the Numidian prince. Massinissa had once fought for Carthage but had been betrayed by them. Scipio promised him restoration of his throne if he joined Rome. Massinissa agreed, bringing his powerful cavalry to Scipio's side. That decision would change the course of history. With his new ally, Scipio tightened the pressure around Carthage. The city's leaders, panicking, sent urgent messages to Hannibal, who was still in Italy. The man who had once been Rome's nightmare was recalled home. For the first time in nearly 16 years, Hannibal would leave Italian soil to defend his own homeland. As news spread, the Mediterranean world held its breath. The two greatest generals of their age were about to face each other. Teacher and student, predator and survivor. Hannibal, the master of strategy who had humbled Rome, and Scipio, the man who had learned from every one of his victories. Africa would decide the future. One would walk away as legend. The other would see his empire burn. The plains near Zama were silent at dawn. In the distance, two armies prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of the ancient world. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the legend who had once brought Rome to its knees. On the other stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Roman who had rebuilt his nation and learned from Hannibal's every move. Hannibal had returned home after 16 years in Italy. He was older now, his hair gray, his army weaker, and many of his veterans long dead. Yet his eyes still carried the same fire, the fire of a man who had once crossed the Alps and shattered Rome's pride. Before the battle, he met Scipio face to face under a white flag. Both men knew what was coming. There would be no more diplomacy after this day. Only one empire would survive. When Hannibal rode back to his lines, he knew what he had to do. Though outnumbered, he still had a weapon that had terrified armies for decades: his war elephants. Over 80 of them stood ready, their tusks sharpened, their bodies armored, their cries echoing across the field. Behind them waited his mixed ranks of Carthaginian, Libyan, and mercenary troops. At the rear stood his best soldiers, veterans from Italy, men who had fought beside him since Cannae. Scipio's army stood calm and silent. He had studied Hannibal too long to be surprised. His men were disciplined, his cavalry commanded by Massinissa, and his lines arranged with gaps between the units. Small corridors deliberately left open. As the sun rose higher, Hannibal raised his hand. The elephants charged. The ground shook under the thunder of hooves and the heavy rumble of beasts. The Romans braced for impact, but Scipio's trap unfolded. Instead of locking shields, his soldiers opened the gaps. The elephants, finding no wall of men to crush, stormed through the empty lanes, roaring in confusion. Roman trumpeters blasted horns, terrifying the beasts further. Many turned back, trampling Hannibal's own infantry. The rest were cut down by Roman skirmishers waiting on the sides. Hannibal's first strike had failed. Now came the infantry. Carthage's first line clashed with Rome's front ranks, and the field erupted in chaos. The two sides hacked, stabbed, and bled in the dust. Scipio did not rush his reserves. He waited, letting the enemy tire themselves. One by one, Hannibal's front ranks began to falter. When the second line tried to advance, confusion broke out. They collided with their own retreating men. That was the moment Scipio was waiting for. He ordered his front legions to pull back in perfect order, drawing Hannibal's center forward. The Carthaginian formation stretched thin, exactly as Rome's had at Cannae years ago. Then Scipio unleashed his flanks. His infantry pivoted inward, and Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, Rome's new allies, crashed into the Carthaginian rear. Hannibal's army, for the first time, faced his own strategy. Encircled, trapped, surrounded. The battle turned into slaughter. Carthaginian soldiers, packed tightly, could no longer fight effectively. Roman steel and Numidian speed tore them apart. Even the veterans who had once triumphed in Italy could not withstand the weight of Scipio's perfected tactics. By late afternoon, the field was covered in bodies. Hannibal's forces were destroyed, and the survivors fled in panic. The man who had once annihilated 80,000 Romans at Cannae now watched his own army collapse in the same way. When the battle ended, Scipio stood victorious. The double envelopment, perfected by Hannibal years before, had now destroyed him. Hannibal fled to Carthage. The city's council begged for peace. The war that had begun with his daring crossing of the Alps ended here, on the scorched plains of Africa. Rome demanded everything: Carthage's fleet, its empire, its future. Hannibal had no choice but to agree. The Second Punic War was over. Carthage was broken. Rome had avenged its darkest day. The smoke of Zama still hung in the air when Hannibal rode back to Carthage. The city that had once ruled the seas now waited in silence. No crowds greeted him. No cheers rose from the walls. The people who had called him their savior now saw the shadow of defeat in his eyes. The council gathered inside the Senate hall. They already knew the outcome. Carthage's army was gone, its allies scattered, its pride crushed. When Hannibal entered, he didn't speak of excuses or glory. He simply said, "I warned you not to fight this war." Then he told them what Rome demanded. The peace terms were brutal. Carthage was to surrender its entire navy, every ship that had once carried its empire across the Mediterranean. It would pay an enormous indemnity in silver for 50 years. Could not declare war without Rome's permission. In short, Carthage would live, but it would never rise again. Hannibal had spent his life fighting to destroy Rome. Now he was the man forced to kneel before it. Yet he accepted peace, knowing that to refuse would mean the destruction of his city. The war that had begun when he crossed the Alps with elephants ended with him standing alone, watching Carthage hand over its weapons. In Rome, news of victory spread like wildfire. The city that had once trembled at Hannibal's name erupted in celebration. Bells rang, sacrifices were made, and banners waved through the streets. For the first time in years, the people felt safe. They had not only survived Hannibal, they had defeated him. Scipio returned home as a hero. The Senate gave him the title Africanus, the conqueror of Africa, but he was not boastful. He had seen too much blood to take pleasure in it. He knew that war was not about glory, it was about survival. His calm humility made him even greater in the eyes of the people. Carthage, once the richest city in the world, now faded into submission. Hannibal tried to rebuild it through politics, serving as a reformer, cleaning corruption, and restoring its economy. But Rome never forgot him. They feared that as long as Hannibal lived, Carthage's spirit might rise again. When Roman envoys arrived years later demanding his arrest, he fled east, to Syria, then to Bithynia, always a hunted man. In his final years, old and tired, Hannibal understood that his war had changed the world forever. He had shown that strategy could defeat size, that genius could terrify empires. But he had also learned that endurance, not brilliance, wins in the end. Rome had lost everything and still refused to fall. That was why it now ruled the Mediterranean. Before his death, he left one last message. "Let us free the Romans from their fear of this old man." Then he took poison, ending his life on his own terms. The man who had once made Rome tremble refused to let Rome decide his fate. With Carthage's power broken and Hannibal gone, the balance of the ancient world shifted forever. Rome no longer fought for survival, it fought for dominance. Within a century, it would destroy Carthage completely, turn the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, our sea, and begin its transformation from a republic into an empire. The ghosts of Cannae were finally laid to rest. Rome had learned from every defeat, rebuilt from every loss, and risen stronger from every scar. From its darkest day to its brightest triumph, the Republic had proven that no power, no genius, and no enemy could match its will. Hannibal had shown the world what greatness looked like. Rome showed the world what endurance could conquer.